He showed weakness and had confidence in the ambassador and allowed him to cause more damage when Canadians' lives are at stake. Why did the Prime Minister wait so long before removing his representative? The Honourable Prime Minister. Regarding China, we will stand for the rule of law. We will respect our commitments internationally, and we will always put the security of Canadians first. I would urge the Leader of the Opposition not to make a judgment when it comes to foreign policy on an issue like this, because he is the one who took to pro-Brexit in a very divisive context in the UK.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's clear that our international partners are quickly losing respect for this Prime Minister. And it's no wonder. After clowning around in India, inviting a convicted terrorist along, he was then forced to accept concession after concession from Donald Trump, all the while managing to anger our partners in Japan and Australia. And now Canadians are paying for his mistakes when it comes to our relationship with China. So once again, why did he show such weakness and wait so long to fire his own ambassador?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
On China, we will continue to stand up for the rule of law. We will respect our international obligations, and we will always put the safety of Canadians first. But, Mr. Speaker, we will take no lessons from that Leader of the Opposition, whose only policy pronouncement on foreign policy has been to come down on one side of the most divisive, destructive debate to happen in the UK for an awfully long time. People will understand if we take no lessons from the Harper Conservatives or from that Conservative on Canada's place in the world.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, that Prime Minister came down on the losing side of that debate in the United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker. But back to China, Mr. Speaker. For days, this Prime Minister allowed Canada's position to be weakened by having his own personal representative interfere with an independent process, politicizing the issue by giving a briefing in his old political constituency. Why did it take so long for the Prime Minister to fire his ambassador?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Again, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite just did it again, coming down clearly on one side of the most divisive foreign policy debate to hit the United Kingdom in a long time. He even boasted about it, saying that he was pro-Brexit before Brexit was cool. Quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, we will take no lessons from those members on the matter of Canada's standing in the world and the great work we're doing on foreign policy.
Order. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we'll take no lessons from someone who has boasted about admiring the basic dictatorship of China. After seeing what that government has done for Canadians in that country. But it's not just in foreign affairs that the Prime Minister is making Canadians pay for his mistakes. We now know that if allowed to continue, the government will raise the carbon tax drastically after the next election. Based on the government's own figures, the carbon tax could rise as high as $3 per ton. So can the Prime Minister, $300 per ton, can the Prime Minister tell Canadians once and for all what the final...
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, 276 days ago, the Leader of the Opposition promised that he would be delivering a plan to fight climate change, and we are still waiting. What we have laid out, Mr. Speaker, is a plan that will not only fight climate change, but make sure it's affordable for Canadians.
Order. I can't hear the Prime Minister. I can't hear people speaking. I need to hear them. I need to hear the person who has the floor, I should say. I can hear a lot of people speaking, but I should only hear one at a time, the one who has the floor on either side. And right now, it is the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Again, Mr. Speaker, 276 days since the member opposite promised a plan to fight climate change, and everyone is still waiting. While we are delivering on a plan that will fight climate change and support families through this transition. That is what we are doing.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it was over 3 years ago that this Prime Minister promised a plan to tackle climate change, and all he's brought in is a carbon tax that is raising the cost of everything for commuters and for households, all the while giving a massive exemption to the country's largest industrial emitters. Now, maybe someone who inherited a family fortune and has never had to worry about money doesn't worry about paying higher costs on fuel and home heating. And now we know that those costs could be as high as $5,000 after the next election. Why is the Prime Minister trying to fool Canadians by giving them a check before the next election and then an ever bigger bill?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
You can always tell the Conservatives are on shaky ground when they stoop to making snide personal remarks. The facts of the matter is, and I can even say for the member's own riding and his own province of Saskatchewan, Canadians in Saskatchewan will be $1,300 better off with our plan to fight climate change and make it affordable for Canadians than they would have we not moved forward with our plan to put a price on pollution so that we get less of it. They want to make pollution free again. We are putting a price on it.
The Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
There is a Canada-wide housing crisis. In Outremont, community groups are welcoming people in tears because they can't find housing. Instead of responding to the urgent crisis, the Liberals are using rhetoric. $14 billion in corporate tax giveaways, tax havens popping up everywhere, while Canadian families are living with a crushing family debt. This government has only built 14,700 affordable housing units during their mandate. When will the Prime Minister make everyday Canadians a priority? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. I'm happy to hear or not happy to hear that the NDP is criticizing repairs to existing housing units. We have a plan for the National Housing Strategy that will help a great number of Canadians find housing, more affordable housing. We acknowledge that this is an important issue. It is of concern to us all. Everyone needs housing, and that is exactly why we're investing.
New Westminster Burnaby.
That statement is unbecoming of a Prime Minister. He knows what he has just said is false. We're talking about a profound crisis. 46% of Canadians are $200 away from financial insolvency. They risk losing a roof over their head. 250,000 Canadians will be homeless at some point this year. If the Prime Minister got out of his limousine and walked a few steps from Parliament Hill, he would meet homeless Canadians. More than 30,000 Canadians will be sleeping at parks and main streets of our country tonight in frigid temperatures. What is the Prime Minister going to do to help them now?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Member Officer, for giving us an opportunity to talk about how we are going to help Canadians from coast to coast to coast. With our new national strategy on housing, we know, the new national housing plan, we know that reducing homelessness by 50% is something that we can achieve, and we're investing to do that. We know that making sure that millions of Canadians have better security in terms of the places they live is something we're doing right now. We have invested tangibly and concretely over the past 3 years, and yes, we will continue to invest because we know there is much more work to do.
Honourable Member for Timmins James Bay.
We have a humanitarian crisis unfolding at Cat Lake, and unfortunately the Minister has done squat, and that's a direct quote from the community. To claim he's making enormous strides in a community where 75% of the homes are so badly off they have to be demolished is a staggering disconnect. It's like a slow-moving Katrina at minus 50 degrees, and when children are being medevaced out to emergency wards in distant cities, we need a sense of urgency. So I asked the Prime Minister, will he agree that the situation in Cat Lake is a national disgrace, and will he commit that he will meet with the leaders to find a solution?
Well, Prime Minister.
Speaker, as the member knows, we are committed to working with Cat Lake on housing challenges. There's a meeting taking place today with community leadership. We are developing both an interim and a long-term plan of action. But we are, unlike what the member is saying, making significant progress in the community. We actually lifted the long-term drinking water advisory just this past December. But we know there's lots more to do, and that's why we are continuing to address the community issues in partnership together.
Member for Timmins James Bay.
Really? That's his answer to people who are living in squalid conditions at -50 together, to pat himself on his back. What a disconnect. You know, the problem is that Cat Lake is the tip of the iceberg, because there are communities across this country that are suffering from the mold crisis. And he appointed his personal friend as minister. And my real deep concern, if the minister can't show any leadership or gumption on a crisis like Cat Lake, how can Indigenous people across this country trust him to stand up on any other issue, him or this Prime Minister?
Hear, hear.
Honourable Prime Minister.
Over the past 3 years, we have made unprecedented investments in partnership with Indigenous peoples right across this country to reduce and eliminate many long-term drinking water advisories, to invest in housing, to open up new schools, to make sure we're creating more health care, more mental health, more clinics. We are investing in partnership with Indigenous communities right across the country. But as the member so eloquently says, there is much more work to do, and we will continue to invest, to grow, to work in partnership, because there is no relationship more important than that we have with Indigenous peoples.
The Honourable Member for Richmond Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, we've got a deficit of $80 billion. Canadians today are paying more taxes than under the previous Conservative government. And, if you can imagine, yesterday the Liberals and the Prime Minister voted against a motion, a Conservative motion, calling on them to simply table a plan to return to a balanced budget without raising taxes. After the carbon tax, which will cause the price of gas at the pump to go up 60 cents, what other taxes will the Prime Minister slap on Canadians? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, 3 years ago, Canadians were fed up with the Conservative approach under Harper on the economy, an approach that consisted in giving benefits to more well-off Canadians, and we didn't see economic growth or job creation, and it didn't work for 10 years, and that's why Canadians turned to us. We have invested in communities. We have helped the middle class. And yes, we have cut taxes for the middle class. The average Canadian family has $2,000 more in their pockets than they did under the Harper regime, and we will continue to. The Honourable Member for Richmond Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, that's all false. The problem is that the Prime Minister thinks that a budget ballots itself. It's incredible. But the problem is that people are having to pay for these mistakes, these failures, these unbridled expenditures. Who are those people? Workers, entrepreneurs, parents, Canadians. Canadians are paying for this. After the carbon tax, what other taxes will they be imposing on Canadians in order to pay for that unbridled spending? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I find it disappointing that a Quebec member is not concerned by the fact that his leader promised us over 276 days ago to present a climate plan, and there's no plan to deal with climate change. No plan whatsoever to help Canadian families. No plan to invest in the economy of the future. We know that Quebecers and all Canadians are very concerned by the environment, and that's why we see the opportunity to put a price on pollution, to create good jobs for Canadian families.
Or Carleton.
A February 2017 Finance Canada document to the minister says that after the next election, the carbon tax will have to go up. A 2015 document from Environment Canada says the price could reach as high as $300 a ton. That would translate, based on the government's own figures, into a cost of $5,000 for an average family in the country. Now, the Prime Minister is responsible for being truthful before the election, not just after. How much is the final price of the carbon tax?
Honourable Prime Minister.
We have laid out our plan for the next 4 years that actually puts a price on pollution and ensures that we return to Canadians a greater amount than, on average, they will pay in terms of putting a price on pollution. That is the commitment we made to Canadians to both fight climate change and make it affordable for people. That is something that the member opposite takes issue with, but perhaps he should take issue with his leader, who has refused refused to put forward his plan to fight climate change for the past 276 days, even though he promised it.
Order. The honourable member for Carleton.
So now we know the political strategy. They'll give a check of a few $100s before the election, and then a bill of up to $5,000 after the election, when they no longer need voters but still need their money. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's been in office now for well over 3 years, and he still refuses to come clean on the true cost of the carbon tax. So once again, I'll invite him to do so right now. How much is the full and final price of the carbon tax?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I've crossed this country, I've heard from Canadians who have suffered from the wildfires, from the droughts, from the floods, from the heat waves that Canadians have been suffering because of the increase in extreme weather events. Canadians know we need a plan to fight climate change, and we need to make it affordable for regular people. And that's exactly what our plan does. We are putting a price on pollution because we need less pollution. The Conservatives, other than wanting to make pollution free again, haven't come forward with their plan, despite having promised it 276.
Honourable member for Carleton.
Only a trust fund millionaire who inherited a massive family fortune would accept a $200 check as compensation for a future $5,000 a year bill. Everyday Canadians who have to pay their own bills and work hard for their own money know that that's a ripoff. These same Canadians are only a couple $100s short of failing to pay their bills already. Why won't the Prime Minister be truthful and tell them how much is the final price of his carbon tax?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Canadians know the price of inaction would be monumental, but we do recognize that we need to build the economy of the future and put a price on pollution in a way that supports regular families in this time. And that's exactly what we're doing by returning money directly to Canadians because we know that supporting families and making life affordable while we fight climate change is essential. The member opposite has no plan to fight climate change, and indeed his leader promised it 276 days ago and still hasn't delivered.
The member for Carleton.
Speaker, I have now said 3 times in a row that the carbon tax could rise up to as much as $5,000 based on the government's own figures in the government's own documents. And 3 times he has refused to rule that out. Now, $5,000 is not a lot of money if you've inherited a big family fortune. And therefore, he's not worried about money because he's never had to worry about money. Mr. Speaker, everyday Canadians do worry about their money. Will he tell them the truth? What is the full and final cost of the carbon tax?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the snide personal attacks are all about distracting from the fact that they have no plan for the future of our economy, no plan to fight climate change, no plan to help families through the transforming economy. These are the things that we are focused on. We have been focused on from the very beginning. We lowered taxes for the middle class and raised them on the wealthiest 1%. We delivered a Canada Child benefit that makes a huge difference right across the country, including 16,000 kids in the member opposite's own riding for $48 million a year in the riding of Carleton.
Order. I want my honourable friend, the honourable member for Prince Albert, to know that even though he's a ways off, I can still hear him very clearly, but I prefer to hear him when he has the floor, not when someone else has the floor. I'm not the honourable member for Desnetting, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Mr. Speaker, in northern Saskatchewan, more and more people are becoming homeless or live in houses that are overcrowded or infested with mold. In Hatchet Lake, as many as 20 people are sharing a single home that is unsafe to live in. Instead of taking this crisis seriously, the Liberals only say that more work needs to be done. Northern families can't wait any longer for this Prime Minister to act. Does he have a plan to address the northern housing crisis? Yes or no?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, not only do we have a plan to address that crisis, we started to put it in place years ago. I can highlight that in Budget 2018, we put $600 million towards First Nation housing, $500 million towards Métis Nation housing, and $400 million for an Inuit-led housing plan. We know we need to continue to work to close the unacceptable gap in housing for Indigenous peoples. There is much more to do, but we are acting, not just talking about it. We are delivering for families right across the country, and will continue to work hard to do exactly that.
For North Island, Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, there's a First Nations elder in my riding whose house is so riddled in mold that it is a serious health hazard to him and his family. After being approved for a CMHC loan to fix it, he was told that he would have to pay all the costs up front. This is a person that just makes ends meet barely. So because he couldn't pay those costs up front, the loan was canceled and he is now living in that mold-infested house. This Liberal government is failing Indigenous communities. Where is the National Indigenous Housing Strategy?
Yeah. Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize that the situation in Indigenous communities across this country is still dire. That's why we have been investing in it. We have been working in partnership with them, but we recognize there is much more to do. We have eliminated a number of long-term drinking water advisories. We've invested significantly in new housing, but of course there are still many more investments to make, much more work to do. But we are closing the gap. We are helping Indigenous communities right across the country, and we will continue to focus on doing what is right to make sure that everyone has a safe and secure place to live right across the country.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, yesterday all of the Liberal members refused to tell Canadians that they wouldn't raise taxes. So what does that mean, Mr. Speaker? Well, it means that those creators of deficits will be increasing taxes. Can the Prime Minister look Canadians straight in the eyes and tell them exactly by how much they will be raising taxes on for Canadians? Unfortunately, the Conservatives are using fear and falsehoods to make Canadians afraid. The first thing that we did was cut taxes for Canadians. We cut taxes for small businesses by 9%. We've invested in the Canada Child Benefit, which gives more money to 9 out of 10 families because we stopped sending the Conservative checks to millionaires. We are going to continue to focus on Canadians and to ensure that we are investing to help them. Canadians are the ones who want to give benefits to the more well-off Canadians. The Honourable Member. Those are falsehoods. In 2015, the Prime Minister promised to wipe out the deficit by 2019, and the Prime Minister has also said that the budget would balance itself. That's not the way things work. In truth, they've run 3 consecutive deficits, very high deficits, and one of these days, a deficit has to be paid back. Can the Prime Minister tell Canadians the truth, look them straight in the face, and tell them exactly how much more in taxes they're going to be paying because of these high deficits? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Under 10 years of the Stephen Harper, the Conservatives added $150 billion to the national debt. Under Stephen Harper, for 10 years, they had the lowest growth rate since the Depression. I understand why Canadians wanted a new approach, and that's why they chose the Liberal government, which has invested in our communities, which has provided more money for the middle class. But what do we see, Mr. Speaker? 800,000 new jobs created over 3 years and the lowest unemployment rate in 40 years. We are investing in Canadians.
House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, never before has the government been so mired in ethical scandals as these Liberals. The Prime Minister himself broke ethics laws, Liberal ministers involved in shady cash for access events, and now we've just learned that the former Liberal MP from Brampton East, the same one who has a massive gambling debt, had a huge Liberal fundraiser where he reportedly raised approximately $600,000, Mr. Speaker. There are a lot of questions around this fundraiser that so far the Liberals are not answering. Can the Prime Minister tell us, did the Minister for Innovation or any other one of the Liberal ministers...
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, Canadians have a right to openness and transparency in political fundraising, and that is why we move forward forward with new legislation to ensure that political fundraising is done under new, transparent, open rules. We have been doing that for close to a year now. It is time, Mr. Speaker, for the Conservative Party to abide by those rules as well, to talk about who is actually donating to the Conservative Party, who is attending fundraising events with their leader, and making sure they're opening them up to media the way that we are. We are open and transparent in our fundraising. Why are they still being...
Order. The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, that was entire fabrication. I know the Prime Minister has problems with the truth, but maybe it's time that he actually came clean with some facts. There are questions around this $600,000 fundraiser. Who went to the fundraiser? Were there ministers in attendance? What happened with over $600,000 that was raised for a Liberal MP with massive gambling debts? Simple questions, simple answers. What's he hiding? Who is he protecting?
Honourable Prime Minister.
I can assure this House that Liberal fundraisers follow all the rules in openness, transparency and accountability. We actually strengthened those rules. But it is, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives who are continuing to hold fundraisers in secret, continuing to keep from Canadians who is donating, how much, who is attending. We have invited the media to attend our fundraisers. They're still being secretive about their fundraising. Canadians want to know who's paying for the Conservative Party of Canada.
Honourable member for order. I didn't know we had owls in the new building. The honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Mr. Speaker, today is Bell Let's Talk Day, which encourages people to have conversations about mental health to raise awareness and reduce the stigma. A recent BC report found that 20 to 40-year-olds may suffer mental health impacts because of lower incomes, higher debt, and high housing costs. A woman in my riding living with mental health challenges told me how she has to live in a storage unit, and sadly, it's true. We need to address both mental health challenges and the housing crisis because for many people, they go hand in hand. Will the Liberal government take action now to address these very serious issues for Canadians?
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Member Opposite, for his question and his advocacy. Almost all Canadians have family and friends affected by mental illness, today and every day. But today is an important day to support those around us, especially those who suffer in silence. We want to ensure Canadians get the support they need when and where they need it. We've made the largest investment in Canadian history for mental health services, $5 billion in Budget 2017. And we've targeted investments specifically amongst Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians, veterans, homeless Canadians. There is much more to do, Mr. Speaker, but today, like every day, we need to talk more about mental health.
Honourable Member for Hochelaga. Mr. Speaker, since 2012, Habitation Nicolet, a seniors' residence in Hochelaga, has been undergoing major renovations, forcing residents to relocate for 6 years. All because the funding for social housing is announced bit by bit every year. What's worse, thousands of units are now boarded up in Montreal. The most vulnerable are the ones who are paying for this lack of a long-term vision. Why, despite all the Liberal spin, do we still have such unacceptable delays? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we fully agree that for far too long the federal government had withdrawn from investing in housing, and that is why we set up a national housing strategy. $40 billion will be invested in communities all across the country. We've invested in seniors housing. We've invested to combat homelessness. There's much more still to be done, but for 2 or 3 years we've been investing to make up for the damage that was done, to build new housing units, and we will continue investing in the most vulnerable.
East York.
Mr. Speaker, this question for the Prime Minister comes from my Beaches East York Youth Council, written by Mika Kay. The UN reports that our planet will reach the crucial threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2030. Our planet is already 2/3 of the way there. Canadians make up roughly 0.5% of the world's population, but we contribute 2% of total greenhouse gas emissions. What initiatives has the government taken, and what initiatives will the government continue to take to reduce this?
Honourable Prime Minister.
The member for Beaches Ms. East Yorth for his question and for his Youth Council question. The IPCC report is a sobering reminder that we need to tackle climate change, and our government is taking action. We have a practical, affordable plan to cut pollution and create good middle-class jobs. It includes phasing out coal, supporting more than 1,000 public transit projects across the country, and putting a price on pollution.
Impressive.
While the Conservatives want to make it free to pollute, we will continue to move forward for Canadians.
For Milton.
Speaker, the former president of the Treasury Board told this House that the only document that he had with respect to the Mark Norman case was a letter on which he was copied. Now, he probably told the RCMP the exact same thing when he was interviewed by them. And it's interesting, though, that just days after he steps back from cabinet, he suddenly has his lawyers going into court and singing a quite different tune on this issue, which is he has many personal documents that he wishes to submit. When did the Prime Minister know that the President of the Treasury Board had personal documents and was withholding this?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
As I've said repeatedly, politicians have no involvement in decisions on this matter. The notion that any politician was involved in those decisions is completely false. Of course, I won't comment any further as the matter is before the courts.
Well, member for Milton.
Mr. Speaker, Admiral Norman was the second highest ranking officer in the Canadian military, and so far we have heard that documents have been withheld from him. Access to information requests have been deliberately sabotaged so as not to turn up any documents. We've learned today about private dinners and conversations and little meetings that happen with the Prime Minister and his inner circle that have surprisingly no notes or documentation to go along with them. This is very concerning. And you know what else, Mr. Speaker? The fact that this Prime Minister stands here and says that there's no political interference when he himself cast Mark Norman in guilt before the charges were being even laid is ridiculous.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
As I've said repeatedly, politicians have no involvement in decisions on this matter. I, of course, have regular interactions with the Chief of Defence Staff. In this instance, the Chief notified me of steps being taken regarding this individual. The notion that any politician was involved in those decisions is completely false. I won't comment further as the matter is before the courts.
The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the Liberal government announced another $114 million for illegal immigrants. The same day, the Liberals shut the door on sponsoring parents and grandparents after just 10 minutes. Under this Prime Minister, if you come into the country illegally, you're allowed to stay, you're allowed in right away, and you're given a free hotel room. If you're a grandmother trying to enter legally, the door is slammed in your face. Why is the Prime Minister making Canadians pay for his mistakes? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. The Conservatives are playing politics with people's lives. What they did when they were in power was 160,000 people backlog, 8 years of waiting for family sponsorships. We've cut processing times to under 2 years. We did away with the backlog, and we quadrupled the number of people who can apply for family reunification. That's our record, Mr. Speaker.
For Calgary Nose Hill.
Prime Minister isn't creating more actual spots for legal immigrants. He's only created a no-hope waiting list. A waiting list isn't the same as getting entry into this country. Instead, he's created a gold-plated express entry lane for who? People illegally entering our country from upstate New York. Canada's Conservatives will restore fairness to Canada's immigration system because, Mr. Speaker, why should Canadians keep paying for this Prime Minister's mistakes?
Prime Minister.
Here is what Canada's Conservatives actually did in 10 years in power. They created a backlog of over 167,000 cases for family sponsorship and an 8-year wait time for families to be reunited. In the past 3 years, we've cut wait times to under just 2 years for family reunification. We've cleared the backlog. And yes, Mr. Speaker, we've quadrupled the number of people who could apply for family sponsorship. That is what we're doing to bring families together, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Motors closed its Windsor plant. It shut the door on 100 years of workers' sweat, dedication, and pride. Today, parking lot.
Has the floor.
When General Motors closed its Windsor plant, it shut the door on 100 years of workers' sweat, dedication, and pride. Today, that site is a parking lot. Now Oshawa faces the same future. Canadians loaned billions to ensure GM kept good jobs in Canada, and since then the Liberals have done nothing. They even ignored their own auto czar who wanted them to act. Workers still don't even know what the government's plan is to save our manufacturing industry. All talk and no action is worthless and cruel. What specifically will this Prime Minister do for the workers of Oshawa and their families? What specific action is he willing to take for these families and that community?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, we stand with GM workers and their families in Oshawa. We met with the workers and the union representatives. I even had a frank conversation with the GM CEO, Mary Barra, reminding her of the proud history of GM in Oshawa, thanks to those extraordinary workers. We continue to work with our partners to support those impacted. We will always fight for auto workers and their families. We will continue to do so.
The honourable member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Mr. Speaker, last week, the ferry between Saint-Ignace and Sorel had to interrupt service for 3 days because of ice jams tying up the St. Lawrence Seaway. Like the Conservatives, the Liberals have neglected the icebreaker situation. Steve Pichet, president of the Berthier-Dautrey Chamber of Commerce, isn't happy about the situation. Without icebreakers and without a ferry, people have to take the bridge in Trois-Rivières or Montreal to get to Sorel. It's a crazy detour. Is this government going to make the St. Lawrence Seaway a priority and invest the necessary sums? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we recognize the excellent work of Davie Shipyard workers who have worked within budget on the Asterix. The Conservatives left Davie Shipyard out of the national strategy. We have invested over $1.5 billion in contracts for Quebec companies, including $700 million for 3 icebreakers at Davie Shipyard. We will continue to support workers all across the country. The honourable member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals can't get federal public servants paid with Phoenix, and now they don't trust Revenue Quebec employees. Why do Quebecers have to file 2 tax returns? They're the only Canadians who have to file 2 returns. We Conservatives respect Quebec and Quebecers. A single tax return would save Quebecers a lot of paperwork. The Prime Minister should respect Quebecers. Why is he so dead set against a single tax return for Quebecers, Mr. Speaker? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. It's interesting, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are saying 2 things, one thing in French and quite another in English. We want to work for Quebec to meet the needs of Quebecers. Quebec has a labour shortage. There are over 1,000 vacant positions, according to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. We are going to keep working with Quebec on those issues.
In both official languages, that the Conservative approach on a single payer for immigration is not something that we think is acceptable to the rest of the country, and certainly not to us either.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, that's an incomprehensible answer. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is using fear-mongering against an idea that Quebecers agree on. In Saint-Hyacinthe, the Prime Minister suggested the sky might fall if anyone other than the feds were in charge. Can the Prime Minister explain why he's so afraid of Quebecers, why he thinks they're a threat, and why he won't let them file a single tax return? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are jeopardizing 1,500 jobs in Shawinigan and Jonquière with this single tax return idea. They would jeopardize efforts to combat tax evasion, which we have invested almost $1 billion in. We will always work with the government of Quebec to simplify tax filings, but the Conservatives are playing politics here. They're talking about one thing in one part of the country, but they're not mentioning it in English elsewhere in Canada. The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. He's the one who's talking about fear-mongering. What's he doing to support federal workers. He's the one who's fear-mongering, Mr. Speaker. The vast majority of Quebecers can't afford to pay someone to do their taxes for them like the Prime Minister does, Mr. Speaker. We have an unprecedented opportunity to make life easier for Quebecers, and that is by allowing people to file a single tax return. It's so simple. Why is he so stubbornly refusing? Order. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. There are a lot of places in the country where there is a single tax return, and if Quebec wants to talk about that, we're certainly willing to talk about it. But the fact is that we expect to continue fighting tax evasion, and that is the federal government that has all those tax treaties internationally. And we employ over 1,500 people in Quebec who process tax returns from all around the country. There's always ways to improve things in terms of the way Quebecers and Canadians file their tax returns, and we're always willing to work with Quebecers and their government. The Honourable Member for Marc-Aurèle-Fortin. Mr. Speaker, our government recognizes the valuable contributions seniors make to Canadian society. We're doing everything we can to ensure their well-deserved comfort and security. Could the Prime Minister tell the House what our government has accomplished for seniors and what we intend to do to acknowledge their contribution to Canadian society? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. I'd like to thank the member for Marc-Aurèle-Fortin for his question. Our government got down to work for seniors as soon as we took office. We brought the OAS and GIS eligibility back to 65, thereby lifting 100,000 seniors out of poverty. We raised the GIS benefits for the most vulnerable seniors living alone, helping 900,000 seniors in Canada. We invested $6 billion in home and palliative care. To take things further, we're holding consultations to further help seniors. Mr. Speaker.
He has managed to keep one of his promises. His promise to phase out the oil sands. Oh, shame. Due to the Prime Minister's failures on pipelines, CNRL is laying off up to 1,000 people. Wow. This is on top of the 120,000 energy workers who have already lost their jobs. Incredible. This pain is going to be felt across Canada. 1 in 7 manufacturing jobs in Ontario is directly linked to the oil sands. Energy workers in Canada can no longer pay for this Prime Minister's mistakes. What is he doing to get these highly skilled Canadians back to work?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize that to move forward on energy projects in this country, we need to do it the right way. That is, in partnership with Indigenous peoples and respecting the concerns of Canadians, including environmental concerns. And we know that for 10 years, the Harper Conservatives failed to do just that. They did not understand that you have to stand up for the environment, that you have to work with Indigenous peoples. That's exactly what we're doing. The Federal Court of Appeals judgment laid out a blueprint for doing this in the right way, and that's exactly the blueprint that we are following, Mr. Speaker. We know getting our resources to new markets is a priority.
Honourable Member, order for Victoria.
In the recent cabinet shuffle, the Attorney General was removed from her role. Then, Grand Chief Stuart Phillips said that her removal as Attorney General demonstrates the Prime Minister's, quote, lack of resolve to address Canada's deplorable relationship with Indigenous peoples. Then, in a written statement, the former Attorney General suggested she was removed from her role for, quote, speaking truth to power. So through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Prime Minister, what could she have meant?
Well, Prime Minister.
Speaker, we have demonstrated consistently that no relationship is more important than that with Indigenous peoples. And that's why we've moved forward in partnership to both respond to the services needed in Indigenous communities, from drinking waters to housing, to a broad range of educational and community investments, to restoring a better relationship in terms of rights, in terms of recognition, in terms of reconciliation. This is what we are focusing on, and it is a all-of-cabinet approach. The entire government is...
The honourable member for New Brunswick Southwest. Order.
Mr. Speaker, going off to college or university is a significant time in our lives. Parents and students alike plan for this important milestone, expecting personal growth and professional opportunities in return for their significant investments. But we know that 41% of all sexual assault cases across Canada were reported by students. Can the Minister for the Status of Women tell this House what our government is doing to end gender-based violence on post-secondary campuses? Thank you.
Good question.
Prime Minister.
I want to thank the member of New Brunswick Southwest for her question. No one should be subject to acts of violence, period. Incidents of sexual assault on school campuses remain one of the most often reported types of violence since Me Too. Nearly half of sexual assault reported in Canada are committed against women aged 15 to 24. That's why our government is working with an advisory committee of survivors, students, and partners that will create a national framework to end gender-based violence on campuses. No students should experience violence in this important part of their lives, and we are taking action.
For Caribou, Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, it's important for us to talk about mental health issues. It truly is the only way that we can break the stigma associated with mental illness and mental injury. 223 days ago, this House passed a bill to create a national strategy to combat PTSD, making Canada the first country in the world to adopt legislation aimed at combating PTSD. 223 days. And this Liberal government has failed to do anything to move this strategy forward. When will this Prime Minister stop delaying and take action on developing this important national strategy to combat PTSD?
Prime Minister.
We have made some of the largest investments in Canadian history for mental health services, $5 billion in budget 2017, but of course there is much more to do, and that's why I'm happy to confirm that this spring we will be moving forward with the plan to fight PTSD that the Minister of Public Safety and Security will put forward.
The honourable member for La Pointe de l'Île. Mr. Speaker, it was there for all to see yesterday. To the Liberals, a Quebec that wants French spoken is a racist Quebec. If you say we Quebecers, you're racist. The Quebec government's desire for permanent residents to have knowledge of French, or the Bloc's desire for citizenship applicants in Quebec to have knowledge of French, well, to the Liberals, that's racist. Will the Prime Minister condemn the unacceptable things his minister said, starting by supporting the Bloc's bill on adequate knowledge of French? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Constitution of Canada defends the rights of minorities living in minority situations all across the country, and we will continue to defend the Constitution despite what the Bloc is trying to say. We are going to respect the Constitution and defend both official languages all across the country.
Pursuant to Standing Order 92.4, I direct that the vote on the designation of Bill C-421, an act to amend the Citizenship Act, adequate knowledge of French in Quebec, resume. I'd like to remind members that they may obtain their ballot from the table officer seated on their side of the chamber. However, during routine proceedings, statements by members and question period, ballots will be distributed from the corridor behind the Speaker's chair, where the ballot box will also be located. The honourable member from Montcalm is rising on a point of order. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, in response to the question from the member for the Député de Lille, the Minister of Heritage said that the Bloc Québécois remarks only divides and is based on color and language. Mr. Speaker, we're being excused of being racist simply because we want to stand up for the French language. However, and also a Quebec that wants to speak French is being treated as a racist Quebec. The Minister of Heritage has to apologize for his baseless remarks. I'd like to thank the member, but that would be a point of debate.
On a point of order.
As is customary, I made reference to a document and wish to table in the House. The document is an Environment Canada briefing note showing that the carbon tax will be $300
consent? No, there is no unanimous consent for the tabling of the document. Tabling of documents.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent is rising on a point of order. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we say is based on facts, and I would like to table and ask for the consent a document where it is written that there will be a balanced budget. Is there unanimous consent? There is no unanimous consent.
Introduction of government bills.